In the late 1920s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had determined to use its remaining treaty-allocated carrier tonnage in more numerous small, fast carriers, each carrying around 3 dozen aircraft. These would be supplemented by a force of loophole-dodging not carriers that it was hoped Rougeot would be the first of. But the London Naval Treaty in 1930 put paid to that idea, and so it was back to the drawing board. However, the London Treaty also contained some very specific wording at the insistence of the US delegation, stating that not more than 1/4 of the cruiser tonnage could be fitted with a flight deck or flying-off platform or landing platform, and that fitting a cruiser with such a flight deck or platform would not make that cruiser into a carrier. This caused the Japanese Navy to speculate that the US Navy was planning cruiser-carrier hybrids. Although none were actually built, this was in fact something that kept popping up in US Navy design circles. To match the perceived threat, the Japanese Navy started in on an idea of their own, Design G6, albeit that this was more a carrier that happened to carry cruiser guns as opposed to a cruiser that happened to carry a flight deck. But G6 was abandoned when a combination of the full implications of the London Treaty in terms of available tonnage became clear, as did some questions about the design's stability. Instead, the design was revised to Design G8, which had more flight deck and smaller and less numerous guns. But the loss of the torpedo boat Tomozuru forced a recognition that trying to get the speed of a destroyer, the guns of a small light cruiser, and the air wing of a fleet carrier onto the standard displacement of a slightly overweight treaty cruiser was madness unless you built the entire thing out of papier-mâché or strapped several large airships to it in an attempt to hold it upright. This led to another design, G9, in which standard displacement leapt almost 60%, surface-only guns were abandoned entirely, and whilst the air group size was retained overall, 16 of the aircraft were relegated to spares and thus could be stored out of the way in bits. As well as greater size, the new carrier was to have a stronger hull and internal framing compared to previously, along with a greater freeboard. Experiments with the largely islandless Japanese carrier fleet at that point had showed that such a structure would be useful, and so a small island was also included on the starboard side. This vessel would become the carrier Soryu, or Blue Dragon. Displacing 16,200 tons standard, she was driven through the water by 152,000 shaft horsepower via 4 screws, with a top speed of just under 35 knots on trials at regular power, or just over 35 knots when she was at emergency power. Her armament consisted of a dozen 5-inch dual-purpose guns in 6 twin mounts, 3 per side, with 28 of the standard 25mm guns distributed in 14 twin mounts just in case they might happen to be useful. Armour was only splinter-proof 1.6-inch plating over the vitals, and the air group, after initially being planned as fighters and dive bombers only, ironically much like USS Ranger, eventually settled on 57 active aircraft plus 16 in reserve, consisting of a dozen fighters with 4 in reserve, 27 dive bombers with 9 in reserve, 9 torpedo bombers with 3 in reserve, and 9 recon aircraft with no spares. A year after Soryu was laid down, a modified vessel was laid down. This took into account the changes to Soryu, as well as the lessons that were being learnt rebuilding Kaga. This ship was to be Hiryu, or Flying Dragon. She displaced 17,600 tons standard due to a number of changes, the most obvious being the relocation of the island to port side and further back, whilst also being made slightly larger. Speed remained the same thanks to slightly more powerful boilers. The anti-aircraft battery was largely unchanged, with only a few additional 25mm being included, and some of these guns now being in triple instead of twin mounts. But protection was significantly updated, with a belt that ran from 3.5 inches over the machinery to 5.9 inches over the magazines. The flight deck was also a metre wider, the bow and stern had even more freeboard, a new rudder was installed, and the internal frame layout was altered for better strength. A fractionally larger hull was also required to contain all these measures, as well as others such as slightly adjusted sizes for the aircraft lifts, and so some sources consider the two ships to be of a single class despite all these changes, much like we consider the Hippers to be a single class, whilst others consider the two ships separate enough to be considered as two successive single ship classes. Soryu was laid down in November 1934, launched in December 1935 and commissioned almost exactly 2 years later in December 1937, whilst Hiryu was laid down in July 1936, launched in November 1937, and commissioned in July 1939. Soryu saw brief service in the Sino-Japanese War before 2nd Carrier Division was revised to consist of Soryu and Hiryu when the latter entered service instead of Soryu and Hiryu. They would then spend the rest of their operational lives working together, first helping take over French Indochina, now Vietnam, then taking part in the Pearl Harbor attacks, both carriers having entered service with a full complement of fighters and strike aircraft as the recon aircraft requirement had been ditched to be replaced with more strike aircraft. Between the two of them, their aircraft were responsible for the loss of Utah and Arizona, whilst damaging the Helena and Raleigh, and taking part in the sinking of West Virginia, Oklahoma, and California. On their way home, they were detached to attack Wake Island, before then taking part in strikes on the Dutch East Indies, as well as on Darwin, Australia, racking up more ships sunk or damaged before being sent into the west as part of the Indian Ocean raid. Here, in addition to merchant ships and land targets, they contributed to the sinking of the heavy cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire, although their aircraft arrived too late to help finish off the carrier HMS Hermes. They also came within hours of being sunk themselves in a night action, whilst they were detached from the main Japanese formation. Only a very rapidly launched Zero from Hiryu prevented Admiral Somerville from learning where the two carriers were and sailing up to them with HMS Warspite that night. The carrier's next and final major mission was to sail with the bulk of the Japanese fleet to the Battle of Midway. After putting up a very effective defence against US aircraft from Midway and the initial attempts by US carrier-based torpedo bombers to attack them, Soryu was surprised by VB-3 from USS Yorktown and was fatally hit 3 times in short order, going from fully functional to abandoning ship in 15 minutes. Although she did later have to be scuttled by torpedoes as the fires had made the ship completely unlivable, but turned out to be not all that effective at actually letting the water in. Hiryu, the only survivor amongst the carriers of the dive bomber attack, launched a counterstrike that crippled USS Yorktown before a return strike of Enterprise and Yorktown aircraft hit her, with similar effects as had occurred earlier on Soryu. She would also be torpedoed after the Battle of Midway was formally concluded.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.